So let's start with the aborted coup by the Wagner mercenary group. What's your take on that? In terms of the power dynamics being played out in Moscow and its implications, if any, for the war in Ukraine.
Well, I think in the West, there was a lot of wishful thinking about the mutiny. I think a lot of people were hoping that it would bring down or greatly weaken Putin, and this would allow Ukraine and the West to prevail over the Russians. But that did not happen. And in fact, I think as a result of the mutiny, Putin's position will be improved. He'll be stronger. And the reason I say that is I think that the existing relationship between the Wagner Group and Prigozhin in particular on one side and the military on the other side was not a healthy relationship. I think there's no way that you can run an army without a rational command structure. And I think that Prigozhin was something of a loose cannon. And the end result of all this is that Prigozhin has been dismissed. The Wagner Group or the Wagner Group is now going to be placed underneath the command of the military. And that will make the Russian military a more efficient fighting force. It's very important to remember that when you start a war, you're taking a peacetime army and you're sending it to do something that it really has not done in a long time, which is fight a war. And this was certainly true of the Russian army. And there are going to be a lot of problems in the initial stages. And as the war wears on, those problems get solved and the military is, in a sense, rationalized. And I think that what happened with the Wagner Group is an example of a clunky military system being rationalized. And as I said a minute ago, I think the end result of this will be that the Russian military is more powerful, and that is all for the good from a Russian perspective.
Um, you're a political realist or neo-realist, so by definition, you're a pessimist. So I get that you don't see much of a prospect of a peaceful settlement anytime soon in Ukraine.
I think, to be honest, there are some conflicts where you can imagine a peaceful settlement because there is an obvious solution. And all that has to be done is that both sides have to be convinced that they should accept that solution. But that's not the case here. There is no solution. And there are two major obstacles that make it almost impossible to have a meaningful peace agreement. And I want to be clear here. I'm talking about a meaningful peace agreement. I think you're eventually going to get some sort of ceasefire that will turn into a cold conflict, but you're not going to get a meaningful peace agreement. And there are two reasons for that. One has to do with the issue of territory, and the other has to do with the issue of neutrality. The fact is that the Russians have now taken a substantial portion of Ukrainian territory, and they have formally annexed that territory to Russia, and they make it clear that they have no intention of giving it back to Ukraine. Understandably, the Ukrainians find this unacceptable. They want their territory back, and they're willing to fight and die to get that territory back. Well, the problem here is you can't solve the difference over territory between Russia and Ukraine, because either Russia keeps the territory or Ukraine gets the territory. They both can't have that same piece of territory. So there's no way you can square that circle. The other issue, the other intractable issue, is the issue of neutrality. The fact is that the Russians are deeply committed to making sure that Ukraine is not a member of NATO, and indeed that Ukraine is a neutral state. That's very important to the Russians, and I believe it was the principal reason that the Russians went to war in February of 2022. It's the issue of Ukraine either being in NATO or being a neutral state. Well, the Ukrainians understandably want some sort of security guarantee. They want some country or group of countries to protect them. And the only countries on the planet that can provide a security guarantee for Ukraine are the NATO countries. And of course, if Ukraine is either de jure inside of NATO or de facto inside of NATO, it's not a neutral state. And that is a situation that's unacceptable to the Russians. So there's no way to solve the neutrality issue and satisfy both the Ukrainians and the Russians. So you have these two major issues, the issue of territory and the issue of neutrality that have no solution. So my argument is you're not going to get a meaningful peace agreement, and the best you can hope for is a frozen or cold conflict.
I was going to ask you, do you anticipate a stalemate or a victory for one side? And I have read your latest piece where you're on the Ukraine, the dark side or the dark hours ahead. And I think your word is that Russia is going to secure a victory, but an ugly victory. What do you mean by that?
Well, a lot of people talk about the possibility of Russia winning a decisive victory. And a decisive victory would be one where Russia ended up conquering all of Ukraine. And as you know, many people have argued for a long time that Russia was determined to conquer all of Ukraine and make it part of a greater Russia. There's no way, in my opinion, that Russia is going to win a decisive victory. They're not going to conquer all of Ukraine for a variety of reasons. The end result is that Ukraine is going to lose some big chunk of territory. The Russians are going to conquer, I believe, more than the 23% of Ukraine that they have already conquered. My guess is that they will end up conquering about 43% of Ukraine. They will end up conquering the Crimean Peninsula and 8 different oblasts, and that will represent a reasonably large chunk of Ukrainian territory, indeed close to half. The end result is that what's left of Ukraine will be a dysfunctional rump state, and that dysfunctional rump state will not be capable of waging a major war against Russia, and it will not satisfy the criteria for joining either the EU or NATO. So this ugly victory that I talk about, that I think Russia is going to win, again, is not going to be a decisive victory where they conquer all of the country. It's going to be an ugly victory where Russia conquers, I would estimate, somewhere in the range of 43% of Ukrainian territory and turns what's left of Ukraine into a dysfunctional rump state. And I think that will be the end result. And I might add that once you get that, you'll have a situation where you have, in effect, a cold peace between the two sides. The Ukrainians will not be happy with this situation, and they will go to great lengths to try to undo it. The West, for its part, will help the Ukrainians try to undermine this cold peace and help the Ukrainians get back some of their territory. The Russians, of course, will do everything they can to undermine that dysfunctional rump state, and the Russians will have terrible relations with the West, and the Russians will go to great lengths to cause trouble in the West so that the West can't cause trouble inside of Russia. So we have a really dark situation regarding the future staring us in the face.
Well, this hot war, how long do you anticipate to drag on before reaching that state where you have a ugly victory for Russia? 1 year, 2 years, or longer?
My guess would be 2 years. It's very hard to say. This is a very difficult question to answer. It's very difficult to answer because it's hard to get your head around the casualty levels on both sides, but especially on the Ukrainian side. You can make a case that the Ukrainians are suffering such massive casualties that this cannot continue for even another year. One could also argue that that's probably not true. And in fact, the Ukrainians are definitely suffering significant numbers of casualties, but they have enough of a manpower pool that they can carry on this war for 2 or 3 more years. Which one of those arguments is correct is very hard to say, given the limited amount of available information we have, and also given the fact that the Ukrainians and the West have a vested interest in spreading disinformation about how badly the Ukrainians are suffering. But anyway, my bottom line is I would think that this will go on as a hot war for another 2 years, and then it will settle into a cold peace. But again, I want to emphasize that it is not only possible, but likely that at some point that cold peace will turn once again into a hot war, because the Ukrainians and the West will not be content with that ugly victory that the Russians score.
China, where does it fit in all this? People are always dragging China into it, especially the Western media. So, what's your take on China's role?
Well, I think, Alex, that China is the big winner in this conflict. The Americans have a vested interest in pivoting full force to East Asia to contain China. The Americans view China as a more serious threat than Russia. It's very important to understand that China is a peer competitor to the United States. China is a truly impressive great power. It is a rising great power. It is a threat to the United States in ways that Russia is not. So the Americans have a vested interest in not getting bogged down in a war in Eastern Europe, and to be more specific, not get bogged down in a war in Ukraine. Furthermore, the Americans have a vested interest in doing everything they can to make sure that China and Russia are not close allies. But what's happened here as a result of the Ukraine war is that it's almost impossible for the United States to fully pivot to East Asia. And furthermore, the Americans have foolishly driven the Russians into the arms of the Chinese, which is a violation of balance of power politics 101. This is manna from heaven for the Chinese. And it tells you that from China's point of view, the best outcome would be if the war goes on and Russia does not lose, and the Americans remain deeply committed and frustrated in Europe so that they can't concentrate on China, and so that they can't do anything to win the Russians away from the Chinese. So again, my bottom line here is that from a Chinese point of view, the war in Ukraine, as long as the Russians don't lose, and as long as the war continues, is good news for Beijing.
What about Taiwan? So many people in Washington, generals at the Pentagon, top official in the White House, always banging on about Ukraine today, Taiwan tomorrow. Where does Taiwan fit in? Is Taiwan going to be a winner or the big loser in all of all this?
Well, a lot of people think that what the Americans are going to do is they're going to win in Ukraine, they're going to finish off the Russians, and then the Americans are going to be free to go to East Asia and strengthen Taiwan's defenses, and Taiwan will remain a quasi-independent state forever. And this will be to China's detriment. That's the dream of many people in Washington. As I said before, I don't think that the Americans are going to win a military victory in Ukraine. And the end result is they're going to be bogged down in Europe. And that's going to mean that the Americans have less time to think about defending Taiwan, to think about putting together an alliance structure to deal with Taiwan. And I also believe that weapons that the Americans would normally send to Taiwan are being sent to Ukraine. Not all weapons by any means, but some weapons. So I think from that point of view, Taiwan suffers from the war in Ukraine. I mean, Taiwan, I think, has a vested interest in seeing the Americans pivot full force to East Asia, and that's not happening. But on the other side of the coin, I think it is important to understand that this war shows two dimensions of conflict that I think are cause for concern on China's part and causes for optimism on Taiwan's part. The first lesson I think the Chinese and the Taiwanese and the Americans will take from this conflict in Ukraine is that when armies have not fought wars for a long time and they're sent into battle, they usually do not function very well. And I think that's what happened with the Russian army in the first year of the war. It was very rusty. There were lots of problems. And this is the point that I made before about the Wagner group, right? The army was, the Russian army did not perform that well, and it had not fought a war like the war in Ukraine in a long time. The Chinese army has not fought a war since 1979, when it fought against Vietnam. You want to think about that. China's army has not fought a war since 1979. So when China's army is sent into battle at some point in the future, it's going to have a lot of problems in the initial stages of the conflict, simply because it doesn't have much experience. And experience matters greatly in warfare. So that's one big problem. The second big problem is that it's quite clear from the war in Ukraine that it is very hard to achieve surprise, and it is very hard to move military forces out in the open where they can be seen. And as we all know, for China to deal with Taiwan militarily, it ultimately has to invade the island. It has to cross the Taiwan Straits. It has to launch an amphibious operation. I believe that amphibious operations are among the most difficult military operations under the best of circumstances. I think given the intelligence assets that now exist on and above the battlefield, it will be extremely difficult for the Chinese to conduct an amphibious operation aimed at conquering Taiwan. The Americans will be able to see what the Chinese are doing, as will the Taiwanese, the Japanese, and the Australians, who will also probably be involved in the fight. They will see what the Chinese are doing. And the Chinese military, as I said initially, will be quite rusty. It will not be battle tested and will have all sorts of problems as a result. The bottom line here is I think that the Chinese will be remarkably reluctant to invade Taiwan. And again, they'll be remarkably reluctant to invade Taiwan because of what's going on in Ukraine. I think the Chinese were remarkably reluctant to invade Taiwan under any circumstances before the war in Ukraine happened. But now that the war in Ukraine has happened and we have seen how it has played out, I think that means the Chinese will be more reluctant now than they were before the war to try to conquer Taiwan by military force. So I would not expect a war between China on one hand and Taiwan and the United States and maybe Australia and Japan on the other in the foreseeable future.
So you're saying the exact opposite of a lot of politicians and US generals. You're saying Ukraine, because most of them are saying Ukraine makes a Taiwan invasion more likely, but you're saying that it actually makes it less likely. If that's one of the lessons that could be taken.
I think that's the bottom line. It makes it less likely. I think if you look at the conduct of the war in Ukraine since February 22nd, and you look at the recent counteroffensive by the Ukrainian army, It's very clear that any time a military force comes out in the open and goes on the offensive, all of those intelligence assets on the battlefield and above the battlefield very quickly zero in on the attacking forces. And then the artillery, the tactical aircraft, the ground-based missiles, and so forth and so on, zero in on the attacking forces. So if you think about a Chinese amphibious force coming across the Taiwan Straits, it's going to be a big fat target for the United States and its allies, assuming they're there to conduct the battle. And it's going to be very difficult for the Chinese military to pull that off. And one could argue that's due in part to the fact that the Chinese military, as I said before, does not have a lot of military experience or wartime experience in recent years. It's not battle tested. But leaving that aside, even if it was battle tested, I think that an amphibious operation in the present military environment would be extremely difficult. And I think the Chinese are not likely to risk a military defeat over Taiwan unless political circumstances are so pressing that they feel they have no choice. In other words, if Taiwan declares its independence, let's say the Taiwanese decide that the United States is so committed to Taiwan at this point in time that Taiwan can declare its independence and the United States will still defend Taiwan, no matter what. And the Taiwanese then go out and declare independence. In those political circumstances, one can imagine a scenario where the Chinese understand that they're likely to suffer enormous casualties, but nevertheless, they feel there is a political necessity to launch an amphibious operation. That's a possible scenario. I think it's unlikely, but it is possible, it is plausible. But absent that, I think when the Chinese look at the costs and benefits of an amphibious assault on Taiwan, they're going to, in almost all cases, reject it and make the case that it's better just to wait and hope for the best over time.
Well, I guess what he says is that will the U.S., will one of the future U.S. administrations be so foolish as to send a message that we will defend Taiwan no matter what? Doesn't matter what the Taiwanese do. I guess that is the danger. But perhaps Washington won't be so foolish, hopefully. There would always be elements of ambiguity in this.
That would be my assessment of what the future looks like. I think it's much more likely that Congress is going to act in a foolish way, and you will have some congressional leaders making the case for Taiwanese independence. But I believe that the present administration, for sure, and even future administrations, to include the possibility of a second Trump administration, I think they would all go to great lengths to maintain ambiguity and to go to great lengths to tell the Taiwanese that under no circumstances can they declare independence, because that would be a move that would almost certainly cause China to launch an offensive against Taiwan. And I think the Americans do not want a war with Taiwan. Excuse me, do not want a war with China over Taiwan. They don't want a war with China over the South China Sea or the East China Sea either. But I think Congress is the problem here, as we have seen, and I think we'll see more of that over time. In fact, in the U.S. Congress, you have a number of individuals who are basically loose cannons. And in the United States, for better or for worse, we don't have a political system where the president alone runs foreign policy. And you have people like Nancy Pelosi and Mitch McConnell, just to name two people, who have lots of autonomy and can cause lots of trouble. But I think ultimately the president matters the most. And I think no president will move beyond ambiguity.
Okay, thank you, Professor, for a very enlightening talk. It's most interesting. Thank you very much.
It's my pleasure, Alex, and thank you for having me on the program.